Henrietta, you've been working with addicts for over 20 years. You meet them every day. You spend your time treating them. When you're not treating them, you're researching them. Doesn't it get you down? And you know, my reply every time is this: no, it gets me up. It gets me up in the morning. I love treating addicts. I love finding out about them. I love going to work with the energy that the whole concept of addictions and trying to stop people from ruining their lives gives me. And part of the energy that I derived from treating addictions people is what I put into creating the first and only, still only, National Health Service clinic for pathological gamblers. And I'm going to tell you about that later, after I tell you a little bit about the journey of how I got there. But first, what I want to do is talk to you about a few of the people that I've come across. The first example is about a policeman who stole from a dead body. Just think of the moral codes that you're breaking. You're a policeman, you've got your professional code, you've got a dead body. I mean, how many people think about stealing from a dead body? That's much worse than stealing from a live body. Think of the whole concept of actually bending down over this body and taking something. This man was a pathological gambler, this policeman. The next example I'd like to give you is one that I've come across many, many times, is parents or grandparents stealing from their children's savings. Now just think of that. Think about what it must take to decide late at night to go up into your children's bedroom and take their £20 note that's been stored there for months from a birthday party or something. And think what it must be like as a child of a problem gambler to wake up in the morning and find your piggy bank gone or the money gone. And I want you to think about that. This talk is about problem gambling, but it's not just about the patients. It's about all the people who are impacted on negatively by the illness. A couple more examples I've got for you. One that really touched me, of a patient of mine whose mother was a pathological gambler and would take her at the age of 6 and leave her in the street while she gambled in a bookmaker's. And this 6-year-old girl walked the streets for hours waiting for her mother to come out of that bookmaker's. And you know what? She's now a pathological gambler herself. Think about this, the genetics and the environmental influences. And my last little story is about another patient of mine, one of my earliest patients at the National Problem Gambling Clinic, and I'll never forget him because he arrived and he looked so sickly and so undernourished that I immediately felt rather maternal towards him. I found out soon that he lived on his own with a parrot and that he had only eaten parrot food for the past month, possibly 2 months, because all his money had been spent on gambling. And he had isolated himself from the rest of the world, ashamed of not having any money to spend, to go out, to meet his friends. At the end of the 2 hours I gave him double time for assessment because I felt so sad for him. He turned around in tears and he said, "Thank you, doctor, you've given me hope for the future. I'm now going to go home and hug my parrot." Pathological gamblers, there's about 500,000 of them in this country at the moment. We know that only about 5% of them actually come for help. What happens to the others? We don't know. But there are about that number out there. And people call it the hidden addiction. Why is it a hidden addiction? Well, most of my life has been spent treating heroin addicts, cocaine addicts, you name it, whatever drug, I've dealt with it, and alcoholics. And pathological gamblers don't have track marks on their arms. They're not walking around with an unsteady gait. They don't have signs of liver cirrhosis. They're not shaking while they're talking to you. It's very hard to know one. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's harder to detect them in primary care. But overall, 0.9% of the population are pathological gamblers. Just to give you an idea of how far back gambling goes, these are Egyptian dice made out of knuckle bones. That's how far back. And just to give you an idea of how many people in this country gamble, 73% of the UK population has gambled in the last year. Now a little bit about my story and how I became interested in addiction. So although I have a very English name, I grew up in Italy speaking Italian as an Italian child, going to an Italian school. And the 60s and 70s in Italy were still very much a dolce vita, a bella vita, the skiing, the beaches, the life, you name it, the beautiful people, apart from one very important factor. Throughout that time, there was a horrendous heroin epidemic that had really broken through across all areas of society. And I grew up, and this is true, I grew up walking to school every day, going to primary school at the age of 6, 7, 8 years old, seeing heroin addicts injecting in the street with their spoons, their lemons, their syringes. And I still remember walking past these people, catching their eye, thinking, what are they doing? Why is no one trying to help? And you know, when you think about yourselves and you think, why did I decide to do what I am doing now, where I am headed now in your careers? Just think back. A lot of you may have made your decisions very early on in life. The syringes were everywhere. They were in the parks where we played with our friends. We used to collect them, make piles of them. We didn't know about HIV. We didn't know about hepatitis C. We used to find blood in all the public toilets. You go to the loo in a public toilet, there'd be blood on the walls. That's changed, of course, but in those years, that's how it was. And I think Lucy, of course, as you heard, was one of my role models. I knew I wanted to be a psychiatrist before I knew what a psychiatrist was. But I do believe that very much seeing those suffering people in the streets really informed my future decisions. What makes some people vulnerable? And what saves others who come across exactly the same opportunities for destroying their lives? What saves them from saying yes? I chose medicine, and after medicine, I did psychiatry. And within psychiatry, I chose addiction psychiatry, which is what I did for many years, detoxing patients. And at the same time, I also felt that that wasn't enough. I really needed to understand the mental processes that led people into making wrong decisions. And therefore, I ended up at Imperial College after I was already a practicing psychiatrist. And I did a neuroscience doctorate. And I looked at one particular bit of the brain, which is a ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, in this talk, that bit of the brain is very important. There isn't much time to go into it now, but just so you know. The other thing I found out after 20 years of working with addictions patients is this. Being an optimist is very, very helpful because people come back and they've relapsed. And what you've got to do is you've got to stay positive. You've got to tell them, don't worry, you can have another go. I know many people who've been abstinent for decades, for whom it took 6, 7, 8 times before they got it right. And thinking about future generations is the other trick. Every time you're helping one person, you're thinking about their children, I think. So here's a Cambridge Gamble task. This is one of the tests that I use in my doctoral thesis. One of the reasons why I'm bringing it here today is for you guys to have a think. Look back and think, when was the last really bad decision I made? When was the last time that I truly, really messed up my chances in life? For many of you, this will be some years ago, possibly when you were a teenager and your prefrontal cortex was still underdeveloped. For some of you, that day could be yesterday. I don't know you. But this kind of test is able to determine who are the risk takers. And the great thing about this test, which I will explain in a second, the idea is that I'm asking you where the yellow square is hidden under the 10 squares that you can see, red or blue. In this case, it's very easy. There's 1 red square, 9 blue squares. Most people would go to that screen and press on the blue because it's highly likely that that yellow square is under a blue square. But when I was doing my research, I realized that some people were naturally predisposed to get highly excited at this and press the red one instead. And although I was doing my research on alcohol dependency as and a prefrontal cortex impairment as a predictor of relapse, I realized very soon that I liked these patients. I wanted to help them even more than the alcoholics. I wanted to know why on earth they were pressing the red button. And so I became interested in risk-taking, read up about gambling. It took me about 6 months, but after 6 months, I think I knew just about everything I needed to know, and realized at that point that there wasn't a National Health Service clinic in the country providing high-quality medical and psychological treatment for these patients. So we had an illness, but we didn't have a treatment. And that's the time when I decided to take the plunge. You know, you have these moments in life and you just think, you have your doubts, you may not be able to help, you may not be able to do a good job, but this is an opportunity. So I took the plunge and I raised £250,000. Not a lot, but enough to set up the first the clinic in the country. It opened a year later in 2008. It took me some time. With a colleague, we created this treatment manual, and we are still using it now. We have 80% success rates for these patients. It's a cognitive behavioral therapy manual, and I'm happy to talk about it at a later date if anyone's interested. Initially, it was just me treating these patients, but soon the clinic grew, and there are about 12 of us working there at the moment. And guess what? We have 700 referrals a year, and that is without advertising, and that is without doing nothing other than answering that telephone or those emails. And I know this could get much bigger, and therefore I've set up a charity called Gambling Concern. And if anyone's interested, you can look it up. The Gambling Concern is aiming to fundraise, to bring more money, to employ more people to work at the clinic. So talking about the clinic and my patients, let me give you an idea of what drives people to take the wrong decisions and do the wrong things when they're pathological gamblers. 84% of my patients have committed illegal acts. Most of those will not be going by the police as forensic histories. There'll be things like stealing from your parents so that you can go gambling. They'll be taking money from your wife or husband without them knowing. And sometimes they're pretty serious things like taking money from your mortgage without your husband or wife knowing and having to cause a family to lose the home, which is something we see quite often. The average loss, £150,000. These are people who are not on great salaries. These are people who very often have rather normal jobs. To repay that kind of money, to turn up at the clinic and say, I want to repay this money, help me with money management, takes a lot of courage. This is why so many pathological gamblers experience suicidal ideation. They experience it because they feel trapped in a reality they have not chosen for themselves. The mean age of onset of pathological gambling at our clinic is 21 years old. But you know, the majority of people I see started much earlier than that. The majority started with their families, gambling in the home, putting bets with their grandparents on the national whatever race here or some sort of holiday opportunity in Las Vegas. There's always something that links them to early activities. And if there isn't, and they have an impulsive predisposition, they were gambling with pennies at school and gambling their money away and having to walk home because they'd lost their bus money home and their lunch money. So they were arriving home hungry. Over 50% of people I see have lost their husbands or wives because of the gambling. That's how alienating it is. And it's downhill all the way after that, because once your family is moved away from you, you're really out there on your own. Think of the example of the parrot. And about 20% have lost their jobs. Sometimes you lose your job because you're gambling all night. You're too tired to turn up for work. And sometimes you lose your job because you're actually defrauding your company. And this is something I also see quite often. What makes a pathological gambler? We've got genetic predisposition, and what I mean by that is about 30% of people we see have parents or grandparents who were pathological gamblers. And it's terribly sad when you see 18-year-olds turning up, still at school, who say, I don't know what's come over me. I'm gambling all day long. I can't stop. And you say, do you have any relatives with this problem? Yes, my grandfather lost his home, etc. And you know then how powerful genetics can be. Sometimes there are environmental influences. Yes, you were gambling with your family. You saw your parents being problematically playing, and this has impacted. Sometimes it's a big win, big environmental impact. You see someone winning a lot of money, or you win it yourself, and this takes over. And neurobiologically, it does something to the reward systems, to the dopaminergic reward systems in your brain, and there you go. You're more susceptible to wins from then on. You seek them out. You chase your losses. Early adverse events are also extremely serious in terms of predisposing vulnerability. People at our clinic very often have had traumatic beginnings, deaths of parents, separations away from the parents. They may have had physical, sexual, or emotional abuse within the household. All of these things somehow have got people to gamble to escape. either at an early life or later on when they remember these episodes. And as I said earlier, some people are just more impulsive, and they make up about 20% of the patient load that we have. Some of the things to look out for if you're worried about someone possibly having one of these problems: the need to gamble more and more money. So you're out there with your friends, you're gambling, one of you is going to be at that casino table for hours after you've all gone home. One of you is going to be at that internet, at that computer, playing poker until the morning instead of revising for their lessons. Someone is going to be chasing their losses, and they'll lose and lose and lose in the hope of actually making up the money they've lost. And if you try and tell them about it and suggest they stop, they become irritable. They shout at you. They tell you to mind their own business. They shut the door on you, and that's what addicts do. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes people gamble to escape the low mood. So what's in the future for us at the clinic, and in general for the treatment of problem gambling? We know that children who are impulsive at a young age are much more likely to become pathological gamblers. So what can we do as experts in this field to prevent these children, to identify them and prevent them from entering a world of alcohol, drugs, and gambling? And the last thing to say is, how can we make treatment work for everybody? 80% success rates in a clinic are fantastic, but why not aim for 100%? So remember this: there are 500,000 pathological gamblers in England at the moment, but it is a medical illness and it can be cured. Thank you.